The night of June 5, 1944, was not just dark, it was alive. The sky above the English Channel hummed with the thunder of aircraft engines. The rhythmic drone of C-47 Dakotas slicing through clouds like knives through flesh. Inside them, young men from the 101st Airborne Division sat in tense silence, their faces painted with black streaks, their eyes staring into the dim red glow of the cabin. Each heartbeat was a drumbeat to history. They were told they were the spearhead, the first to leap into Nazi-occupied France. Their mission was clear but terrifying: land behind enemy lines, secure vital crossroads, and hold ground until the beach landings commenced. Most of them were barely out of high school. Many had never fired a shot in anger. Yet now, they sat, strapped to parachutes, hands gripping rifles and letters to mothers they might never see again. As they neared the Normandy coastline, flak began to rise like fireflies, brilliant bursts of orange and white, blooming in the black night. The planes jerked and rocked, some bursting into flames mid-air. Inside the troop bay, the jump master shouted over the roar, "Stand up, hook up." Boots thudded on metal floors. The green light blinked on. A final prayer, then, into the darkness, they tumbled out like shadows. The wind was violent, the sky chaotic. Men scattered for miles, often landing far from their drop zones. Some were shot in the air. Others drowned in flooded fields, weighted down by gear. What was meant to be a coordinated drop was now a chaos of isolated clusters. But chaos was something they had trained for. Private Jack Halpern landed in a hedgerow, alone, tangled in branches. He cut himself loose, ears still ringing from the descent, heart pounding in his throat. All around him, the night echoed with gunfire, shouting, in German, and the distant thump of artillery. The invasion had begun. By dawn, groups of paratroopers were converging near the town of Carentan, critical junction between Utah and Omaha beaches. Holding it meant linking the Allied forces. Losing it meant exposing a fatal gap. And the Germans knew it. Carentan was a quiet town of stone houses and narrow streets, surrounded by Bocage-dense hedgerows that turned the countryside into a deadly maze. Waiting there were the Fallschirmjäger, German paratroopers, elite soldiers with iron discipline and a reputation for ferocity. They had orders to hold Carentan at all costs. The 101st regrouped, patchwork style, forming companies out of whoever they could find. Some officers were killed, others emerged as natural leaders in the fog of war. One such man was Lieutenant Marcus Brandt, a former history teacher. He now stood in mud and sweat, gripping a Thompson submachine gun, rallying scattered troopers. "We take the town, or we all die trying," he muttered, more to himself than to those around him. No one questioned him. They moved with quiet urgency, weaving through the hedgerows like ghosts. Every step forward was a gamble. By the evening of June 10th, the battle had fully ignited. The 101st launched their assault on Carentan, meeting stiff resistance at every turn. Machine gun nests hidden in windows, snipers on rooftops, mortar falling from unseen positions. It wasn't just street fighting, it was house to house, room to room, hand to hand. Inside a butcher shop, Sergeant Donnie White and two others took cover behind a counter as bullets punched through the walls. One man screamed hit in the league. White dragged him behind a cold locker, whispering, "You're gonna make it, kid," but he didn't know that. None of them knew anything anymore except the fight. The Fallschirmjäger fought with brutal precision. They were outnumbered, but not outmatched. Their defense was calculated, cruel, and efficient. They turned every house into a fortress, every alley into a trap. For every inch the Americans gained, they paid in blood. Above, German artillery thundered. From the outskirts, the air reeked of smoke and wet stone. Screams mingled with orders shouted in two languages. The line between enemy and friend blurred in the fog of gunpowder. Private Halpern found himself alone again, pinned behind a stone fountain in the town square. Across the courtyard, a German soldier crouched behind a burned-out truck, both men exchanging blind fire. Then silence, then movement. Halpern raised his rifle too slow. The German emerged and aimed, but a single shot rang out, and the German collapsed. Behind Halpern, a paratrooper with a shattered helmet and bleeding nose nodded once. "Keep moving," he said, voice flat, eyes hollowed out. By midnight, the Americans had gained little ground. Their numbers thinned, ammunition low, bodies scattered across cobblestones, yet they pressed on, driven by duty, fury, and something deeper, perhaps the desperate desire to survive long enough to see daylight. In the early hours, a storm rolled in. Rain soaked the rubble and corpses alike. The town, already broken, seemed to mourn the carnage unfolding within it. Yet in the darkness, something shifted. Reinforcements arrived. Troopers who had been lost now found their way into the fight. A renewed push surged through the narrow streets. Lieutenant Brandt led a charge down Rue du Moulin. Gunfire tore into shutters and plaster. A grenade landed nearby. He kicked it away. "Go," he shouted, even as bullets ripped past his ears. The men followed, not because they were fearless, but because fear had been burned out of them. Stormed a house where German paratroopers had dug in. Inside, the walls were stained with blood. A young German soldier, no older than 17, dropped his weapon and held up shaking hands. Brandt hesitated, then lowered his own. He didn't speak German, but in that moment, language wasn't necessary. Outside, Sergeant White radioed HQ. We're in the heart of the town, but resistance is still strong. We need artillery support now. Moments later, American shells began pounding the outer edges of Carentan. The earth shook with fury, trees cracked, buildings collapsed. Some of their own men were caught in it, but so were the Germans. By dawn, June 11th, the streets were eerily quiet. Smoke curled from broken chimneys. A dog barked in the distance. The surviving Americans moved like ghosts, checking corners, clearing buildings. The Fallschirmjäger had pulled back, their lines broken, their numbers shattered. Carentan belonged to the 101st, but there was no celebration, no cheering, just the dull weight of what had been lost. Jack Halpern sat on a curb, hands trembling, helmet missing. He stared at a photograph he had carried since England, a picture of his sister and dog. It was stained with blood. He didn't know if it was his. Nearby, Lieutenant Brandt leaned against a wall, eyes closed. His hand rested on a rosary tucked beneath his shirt. Around him, the roads outside Carentan weren't roads anymore. They were veins of mud, carved by tanks and boots, soaked in blood and rain. The hedgerows, so picturesque in peacetime, had become deadly green walls that swallowed men whole. Each field was a fortress, each bend in the path a potential kill zone. After Carentan fell, the paratroopers didn't rest. Orders came swiftly. The Germans were regrouping nearby, digging in for a counterattack, and the 101st Airborne couldn't afford to let them breathe. The goal: push out, dig deeper, hold the line. They were exhausted, bruised, and undersupplied, but they moved. Lieutenant Marcus Brandt led his battered unit through the bocage, navigating the twisted lanes like a blind man tracing a maze. Visibility was a joke. The hedgerows were so tall and thick that even sunlight struggled to find its way in. Every step forward felt like an invitation to death. They passed by corpses, American, some German. Flies buzzed. The stench of decay mixed with gun oil and wet leaves. War had a smell, a sticky, inescapable aroma that clung to your skin, your lungs, your memories. Brandt didn't speak much anymore. He gave hand signals, pointed, nodded. His men understood. Words had become dangerous luxuries, noise that could give away a position or betray fear. In the bocage, silence was survival. Private Jack Halpern trudged behind, rifle lowered, eyes scanning every shadow. He was no longer the green boy who had dropped into Normandy 5 nights ago. His face had hardened. He didn't shake anymore when he pulled the trigger. He just didn't talk about what came after. That afternoon, they reached Hill 30, a rise of land that offered a rare vantage point over the surrounding area. It also offered one hell of a target. The moment they crested the hill, machine gun fire tore into the brush, chewing up earth and leaves. Brandt dove forward, landing in a shallow ditch. Ambush, someone shouted, but they already knew. The gunfire came from a German MG-42 hidden behind a collapsed stone wall. Its operator, a veteran Fallschirmjäger, fired in tight, controlled bursts. He wasn't spraying, he was hunting. Brandt called for flanking movement. 2 men moved right, crawling like snakes through mud. Another pair circled left. Halpern stayed in the ditch, eyes locked on the barrel flash. Every time it blinked, he marked its location with a prayer, then dashed silence. The Germans were reloading. Now. Brandt roared, breaking cover. Grenades flew. One exploded short, sending chunks of earth into the sky. The next landed true. A burst of flame. Screams. The MG-42 went quiet. The paratroopers stormed forward, rifles barking, bayonets ready. When it was over, the German team was dead. 2 were boys 16 maybe. One wore a crucifix around his neck. Halpern stared at it for a long time before gently closing the boy's eyes. He didn't say a word. They held Hill 30 through the night. Rain fell in sheets. They dug foxholes with trembling hands, sharing what little rations they had. Brandt passed around a can of peaches. It tasted like victory and guilt. At dawn, scouts, reported movement Germans, approaching from the south, not infantry tanks. Panzer, IVS. The paratroopers had no armor, no artillery, just bazookas, and fear. But retreat wasn't an option. Carentan had to stay secured. Hill 30 was the hinge on which the entire line would hold or break. They set up defensive positions. Bazooka teams took cover behind haystacks and craters. Riflemen spread out along the tree line. Brandt paced quietly behind the line, checking ammo, patting shoulders. No speeches, no lies, just presence. The tanks came rumbling through the trees like metal beasts. Behind them, German infantry advanced in formation, precise, confident. The Fallschirmjäger were coming back with teeth. The first bazooka fired and missed. The second hit, crippling a tank's tread. It spun in place, smoking. The rest kept coming. Machine guns rattled, grenades flew. The air became a furnace of noise and violence. Dirt erupted in geysers. Men screamed. And through it all, Brandt moved like a ghost, barking commands, dragging the wounded, firing his Thompson until the barrel steamed. Halpern was knocked down by a blast. Ears ringing, vision blurry. He crawled to cover, hands bleeding. In front of him, a German soldier charged with a bayonet. Halpern raised his rifle and fired twice. The man fell at his feet. It wasn't personal anymore. It was mechanical, a sequence of survival. By midday, the tanks had pulled back, smoking and stalled. The German infantry, bled dry, retreated into the hedgerows. The Americans held. Barely. They buried their dead that night in shallow graves marked with helmets. Brandt stood over each one, whispering names, sometimes first names, sometimes just kid. He carried a notebook now, recording them. It was his way of not letting them vanish. Then came word. The 17th SS Panzergrenadier Division was moving toward Carentan. Reinforced, hardened. If the Americans wanted to keep the town, they'd have to fight again, harder, bloodier. The 101st didn't flinch. Over the next 2 days, Carentan became a meat grinder. Buildings collapsed under artillery barrages. Trenches filled with rainwater and blood. Germans counterattacked in waves, pressing into every gap, every weakness. The Fallschirmjäger fought with fanatical resolve. They knew the terrain. They were defending not just land, but pride. Brandt was wounded by shrapnel shoulder and thigh. He refused evacuation, tying a bandage with one hand, his teeth clenched. "We don't leave," he growled. "Not until they do." The paratroopers dug deeper. They used doorways as firing positions, cellar windows as hideouts. One man, Corporal Miguel Reyes, climbed into a church tower and spent 6 hours as a sniper, picking off German officers until the bell tower was shelled to ruin. He survived and dazed but alive. They fought without sleep, without warmth, with dwindling ammunition. Some men used captured German weapons when theirs ran dry. They wrote letters in the dirt, messages to home, to no one. And yet inch by inch they held. On June 13th, the tide shifted. Armor from the 2nd Armored Division arrived, Sherman tanks rolling into Carentan like guardian angels. Their cannons roared, and the Germans, exhausted and broken, began to fall back. Some surrendered, others melted into the trees, hoping to fight another day. Halpern stood atop a pile of rubble that had once been a bakery. Smoke curled behind him. In his hand was a photograph. Dirtied, wrinkled. His sister again. He tucked it into his helmet, then joined the others in what remained of the town square. Brandt limped beside him, blood still seeping from his side. He said nothing, just nodded. Their eyes met, not with triumph, but with the recognition of shared survival. Carentan was theirs, but what it cost was beyond calculation. Victory in Carentan came quietly. There were no parades, no trumpets, just smoke in the air, shattered glass underfoot, and the dead, dozens of them strewn in alleys, collapsed in foxholes, folded into the ruins of homes they had never lived. The town was taken, but no one celebrated. They were too tired to cheer, too broken to pretend it was over. For the 101st Airborne, the battle's end marked not relief, but a new kind of torment. Holding what had been one. With Carentan in Allied hands, the Germans shifted tactics. No longer attacking in waves, they struck like ghost snipers in towers, mines hidden under rubble, artillery timed to when the men tried to sleep. The town was no longer a battlefield, it was a trap. Lieutenant Marcus Brandt stood at the edge of a crater in the town square, his wounded arm stiff against his side, wrapped in a bloodied sling. He surveyed what was left. Scorched buildings, shattered windows, walls crumbling under the weight of silence. He could hear water dripping somewhere, a sound too peaceful for a place like this. Behind him, Jack Halpern sat on a doorstep with other troopers, eating from a dented can. He had learned to eat fast before the shelling started again. The boy next to him, maybe 18, chewed in silence, eyes unfocused. "You okay?" Halpern asked. The kid didn't answer. Maybe he didn't hear. Maybe he couldn't anymore. Called them the ghosts of Carentan, the survivors who didn't speak, who flinched at loud sounds, who woke screaming in the middle of the night. Men who had lost more than blood. They had lost the version of themselves that existed before Normandy. For days the Americans dug in. Reinforcements trickled through the narrow roads, bringing supplies, bandages, and rumors. The beachheads were secure, but the Germans were regrouping deeper inland. Soon, the Allies would push south. But to do that, Carentan had to hold. Brandt gathered his men in the remains of a schoolhouse. Half the roof was gone. Chalk still marked the blackboard. Behind him, "We're not done," he said simply. "They'll want this town back." No one responded. They just nodded, adjusted their rifles, and went back to their positions. It started 2 nights later, a distant whistle, then thunder. Artillery shells screamed in from the north, shattering a row of buildings near the river. Fire lit the sky, sirens wailed, and the town exploded into chaos again. German infantry moved through the hedgerows like shadows, pressing toward the outskirts of Carentan. The Fallschirmjäger were back with new orders and fresh resolve. This was no longer about strategy. It was about pride, about revenge, about reclaiming something sacred in the southern quarter. Sergeant Donnie White coordinated a hasty defense. His men, no more than 14, spread across collapsed storefronts and doorways, rifles ready, fingers numb. "Hold until daylight," he told them. "Then we counter." But the night was long, and dawn felt like a fantasy. Machine guns roared, mortar dropped. The air stank of cordite and blood. Halpern manned a window above an old bakery, picking off targets in the flickering shadows. At one point, a German soldier sprinted across the street and tossed a grenade. It bounced once twice and then vanished through a doorway. Seconds later, screams. The building shook. Halpern didn't look, he just reloaded. They fought for every inch, for every corner of every block. Communication lines were cut, radios jammed, runners shot mid-sprint. The paratroopers fought in isolation, relying on instinct and memory. They didn't know where the front line ended or began. The whole town was front line. Brandt moved through the chaos like a man possessed. Blood caked his uniform. He carried a borrowed rifle. His voice had gone hoarse from shouting. Left flank, move, move. He dragged a wounded soldier to cover with one arm, teeth clenched, eyes blazing. In one alley, a German MG team pinned down 3 paratroopers. Halpern and another private crawled through sewer tunnels and emerged behind them. The firefight was quick, brutal. One German turned, saw them, and froze just a kid. Halpern fired anyway. Later, in the same alley, Halpern vomited behind a cart, not from the smell, not from the heat, from the silence that followed. By dawn, the Germans pulled back again, but not far. They had learned the town's defenses. They knew the paratroopers were stretched thin. The next attack would come harder. The Americans held meetings in basements, mapping out defense grids by candlelight. They rigged choke points with mines, repositioned machine guns, and reinforced barricades. Every man carried extra ammo. No one complained about blisters anymore. No one mentioned sleep. Reinforcements arrived, fresh faces, clean uniforms, wide eyes. They asked questions. How bad is it? Halpern said nothing, just handed them sandbags and told them to start building. The next assault came under a full moon this time. The Germans launched a feint from the east, then hit hard from the west. Fallschirmjäger stormed a farmhouse near the river, using it as a staging point. Brandt ordered an immediate counterattack. Halpern joined the team. 6 men crept through the ruins, hugging shadows. They crossed a ditch filled with rainwater, then crawled through wheat fields. The farmhouse loomed at headlights in the windows, voices inside. German. They tossed grenades first. The building shook. Then they rushed in. What followed was chaos. Close quarters, muzzle flashes, inches from faces, screams, boots on stairs. A man falling from a balcony. Halpern shot a soldier who rushed at him with a shovel. Another paratrooper was stabbed in the back, his body folding wordlessly. When the smoke cleared, the Americans stood over the bodies. One was still alive, gasping. Brandt knelt beside him, placed a hand on his chest. "It's over," he whispered. The Germans' eyes locked onto his. Then they went still. They burned the farmhouse that night. Let the flames light the sky. It was a message. But the Germans didn't stop, not that night. Not the next. In the cemetery outside Carentan, 2 paratroopers dug in behind tombstones. The marble offered decent cover. German snipers picked at them from the trees. One trooper farm boy from Nebraska took a bullet to the throat. His partner held him as he died, whispering nonsense just to keep his voice company. Back in town, the medics worked non-stop. The aid station was overrun. Bloody bandages, morphine shortages, screams muffled by rags. A lieutenant lost both legs. Another begged to go back to the front, arm in a sling, face barely stitched together. Brandt finally collapsed from blood loss on June 16th. He had hidden his worsening wound too long. They carried him to the aid station. Before passing out, he gripped Halpern's hand and said, "Don't let them take it back." Then he was gone into the haze of morphine and prayer. Halpern stood over his lieutenant, jaw tight. Then he turned, picked up Brandt's notebook, the one with the names. He tucked it into his jacket and returned to the line. That night, the Germans attacked one last time. It was their most desperate push, a gamble. They hit from 3 directions, using smoke, grenades, even flamethrowers. But the pair held, with fire and steel and spite, with bayonets and fists. When the ammo ran out, with screams and silence. By dawn, it was over. Carentan stood, still battered, still burning, but still American. And the Fallschirmjäger, what was left of them, had vanished. The morning of June 11, 1944, broke with an eerie silence that wrapped the fields surrounding Carentan in an oppressive stillness. Fog drifted low across the hedgerows, muting the landscape like a war-scarred painting gray, jagged and waiting to erupt. On the American side, the paratroopers of the 101st Airborne, who had been scattered like seeds on Dita, were finally regrouped and prepared to make their move. Facing them was the 6th Fallschirmjäger Regiment of the German Army, elite paratroopers who had fought in Crete, Russia, and Italy. They were no ordinary soldiers. They were hardened, disciplined, and determined to hold Carentan at any cost. The town was more than just another dot on the map. Strategically, it was vital. It linked Utah and Omaha beaches, and was the key to unifying the Allied front. But for the men involved, it had become something far more personal. It was about proving themselves. For the Americans, still raw from their first days in Europe, it was a baptism by fire. For the Germans, it was a line in the sand. A final stand on a continent slowly slipping from their grasp. The first gunshots of the day cracked through the mist like thunderclaps. The 506th Pier advanced from the north, moving through the bocados, deadly hedgerows that made every field a fortress. Machine gun fire raked across the lanes, and mortar thumped in the distance, shaking the earth. The Germans were dug in, their MG-42s positioned with lethal precision. Every movement forward cost lives. Screams echoed through the fog, lost in the cacophony of war. Lieutenant Dick Winters led one of the spearheading units. His men were tired, many wounded, but their resolve was unbreakable. "We move together," he shouted. "No one gets left behind." Through narrow paths and fields, they pushed on, returning fire and dragging wounded comrades to safety. The Germans fought back with the tenacity of cornered wolves. Their commander, Major von der Heidt, had vowed to hold Carentan or die trying. He knew reinforcements weren't coming. He knew they were outgunned. But surrender wasn't in his vocabulary. As noon approached, the sun began to burn off the fog, revealing the full scale of the battlefield. Smoke curled from shattered barns. Trees splintered under artillery blasts. American Shermans rolled in cautiously from the west, supporting the infantry with high-explosive shells that turned buildings into dust. But Carentan was not giving in. The Germans had fortified key intersections, turning each street into a death trap. One moment captured the raw brutality of the day. A squad of Americans rushed a narrow alley, only to be cut down by machine gun fire from a hidden nest. In the second story of a farmhouse, the survivors flanked the building, tossing grenades and storming in with bayonets fixed. It wasn't a firefight, it was hand-to-hand combat. Knives, rifle butts, fists. The air was thick with sweat, gunpowder, and desperation. The 502nd PIR launched a coordinated assault on the German left flank. Explosions tore through the hedgerows, and tracer rounds zipped overhead. Sergeant Wild Bill Garner led his men with reckless courage, charging through the open with bullets snapping around him. "If we stop, we die," he yelled. And they didn't stop. They stormed the German trenches, bayonets flashing, rifles barking. The enemy fought with equal fury, refusing to give an inch. In one instance, both sides ran out of ammunition and fought each other with entrenching tools and broken helmets. The cost was staggering. Entire platoons were reduced to a handful of bloodied survivors. Medics scrambled across the battlefield, dragging men from the mud, dodging sniper fire, working miracles under impossible odds. One medic, PFC, Eugene Rowe, worked tirelessly with his hands trembling from exhaustion, whispering prayers as he tried to stop the bleeding of a dying comrade. "Hold on," he murmured, though both of them knew the truth. Inside Carentan itself, the Germans had rigged explosives on bridges and choke points. As the Americans approached the town's heart, entire buildings were leveled in an effort to slow them down. Flames engulfed storefronts, and the streets ran black with soot and red with blood. Yet through the chaos, the stars and stripes advanced. Window by window, room by room, the paratroopers cleared the town, firing point blank through shattered doorways and stairwells. Then came the counterattack at dusk, just as the Americans began to consolidate their gains. The Germans launched a desperate push from the south. It was a last gamble, Fallschirmjäger, charging behind a line of Panzerschreck teams and mortars. The thunderous clash nearly broke the lines. American positions faltered. One machine gun nest ran out of ammo and switched to throwing rocks and helmets. It was madness. But then, from the ridge, came reinforcements. The 2nd Armored Division had arrived. Sherman tanks thundered down the hill, guns blazing. The Germans scattered. The town, once again, turned into a battlefield as armor crushed debris under its treads and .50 caliber rounds ripped through enemy lines. The tide had turned. Night fell over a battered Carentan. Fires glowed in the ruins. Bodies lay sprawled in alleyways and courtyards, American and German alike. The air was heavy with cordite and grief, but the town was in Allied hands. For the men of the 101st Airborne, it was a hollow victory. They had taken Carentan, but at a terrible price. Some companies had lost over half their strength. Letters would be sent home to mothers and wives, words carefully chosen to mask the brutal truth. There was no time to mourn. The front was moving. Tomorrow they would march again. And yet, something had changed. The veterans of Carentan were no longer the fresh-faced boys who had jumped into Normandy. They were soldiers now, hardened by fire, bonded by blood, tempered by sacrifice. They had faced Germany's best and emerged standing. The battle for Carentan was more than a clash of paratroopers. It was a symbol of grit, of courage, of the impossible made real. And it was only the beginning of what awaited in the hedgerows of France. The smoke over Carentan did not lift with the sunrise. It lingered like a veil of sorrow, wrapping the ruins of the town in a heavy silence. Birds no longer sang in the hedgerows. The morning breeze carried the faint, acrid smell of gunpowder and charred wood. For those who survived, there was no celebration, only quiet glances, bandaged wounds, and the understanding that nothing would ever be the same again. Soldiers walked the streets like ghosts. Some searched for friends among the rubble, calling names that would never be answered. Others sat on curbs, rifles across their knees, staring into the horizon as if expecting more death to come. In one square, a medic gently closed the eyes of a fallen comrade, whispering a prayer that vanished into the wind. The battle was over, but the war had not ended. News of the victory spread quickly. Radios crackled with static-filled reports. Carentan secured by Allied forces. Fierce resistance encountered. German paratroopers neutralized, but the headlines could never capture the truth. The screams, the mud, the blood smeared on stone walls. For every inch taken, lives had been traded. Among the American ranks, the 101st Airborne had suffered grievously. Entire companies had been decimated. Many of the dead had no graves, only dog tags, hastily collected and marked on crude maps. Captain Winters, his face drawn with fatigue, stood over a list of casualties. He didn't speak, he didn't need to. The silence around him said it all. Behind every name was a story, a family, a life cut short. Yet the mission had succeeded. Carentan was the crucial link between Utah and Omaha beaches. With it secured, the Allied front could be unified, supply lines could flow, and the push into France could continue. The men had done their job, and in doing so they had altered the course of the war. For the Germans, the defeat was bitter. Major von der Heydt had led his men with valor, but the weight of Allied firepower had been too great. Those who survived the retreat did so with broken spirits. Many of them had fought in every major campaign since the beginning of the war. Carentan, for some, would be their last stand. As they slipped away through the countryside, the fields they had defended became silent witnesses to a fading cause. The people of Carentan, those who had lived hidden in cellars during the fighting, slowly, cautiously, they were met not with the faces of conquerors, but with the weary, mud-streaked eyes of liberators. Children stared at the American soldiers with awe. Some women wept openly, clutching rosaries, crossing themselves in the presence of uniforms they once feared might never arrive. One old man, his cane trembling, approached a paratrooper and simply said, "Merci." That single word carried the weight of an entire town's gratitude. As the days passed, Carentan transformed from a battlefield into a temporary sanctuary. Field hospitals were set up in the ruins of churches and schools. Soldiers shared their rations with civilians. Engineers repaired roads and bridges, while chaplains offered mass in crumbled courtyards. Though the town had paid a terrible price, it was now part of something larger: liberation. But the scars remained. A mother buried her son in her garden, placing a single rose on the mound. A soldier carved a cross from broken wood, marking the place where his friend had fallen. In one street, a helmet sat alone, atop a rifle plunged into the ground. A silent vigil for the dead. Carentan had become hallowed ground, not just for Americans or Germans, but for anyone who had borne the weight of war. Letters began to arrive at homes across America. Typed words, signed by commanding officers, explaining the bravery and sacrifice of sons, husbands, and brothers. But no letter could explain what really happened in Carentan. No words could capture the cold terror of charging through machine gun fire, the anguish of holding a dying friend, or the numbness that settled in after it was all over. The families would read the words, hang the medals, and live with the emptiness. Yet, even in the heartbreak, legends were born. The tale of the 101st Airborne's stand at Carentan spread through the ranks and across the sea. Newspapers wrote of their courage. Commanders praised their discipline. But among the men themselves, there was no boasting. Only nods, shared glances, and quiet toasts to the fallen. They didn't need glory. They had earned something far more enduring respect. That as the Allied advance continued through France, the lessons of Carentan echoed in every step. The importance of unity, coordination, and sheer willpower. The town had become a crucible, a place where boys became soldiers and where the idea of sacrifice took on a human face. It was no longer just about winning a war. It was about each other. Months later, when Paris was liberated and the Germans began to retreat across their own borders, veterans of Carentan would remember the hedgerows, the smoke, the blood-soaked fields. They would carry those memories for the rest of their lives. Some never spoke of it again. Others told the stories, always beginning with the same sentence: "You wouldn't believe what we saw in Carentan." In years to come, historians would analyze the tactics, the troop movements, the logistics. They would speak of Carentan in terms of maps and numbers, but they would never understand what it truly meant, not unless they had stood in that alleyway, under fire, praying for one more breath. Memorials would be built, names would be etched into marble, flags would fly in cemeteries where rows of white crosses stretched toward the horizon. Visitors would walk the grounds in silence, some with tears, some in awe, and beneath each name would lie a story: a boy from Kentucky, a teacher from New York, a mechanic from Detroit, ordinary men who gave everything for a moment in history, and Carentan would never forget. Each June, the town would hold ceremonies. French families would lay flowers at American graves. Children would sing songs in both languages. Veterans would return, some in wheelchairs, some with medals glinting in the sun. And in their eyes, one could still glimpse the boys they once were, the boys who jumped from the sky and changed the fate of a nation. The clash between the 101st Airborne and the German Fallschirmjägers was not just a tactical engagement, it was a moral one, a test of endurance, character, and faith. It was about fighting not just against an enemy, but for something, for freedom. For each other in the end. Carentan was won by courage, not just the kind that runs into battle, but the kind that holds steady when hope is fading, the kind that refuses to surrender, even when the odds are unbearable, the kind that lives in the hearts of men who know they might not survive, but go anyway. The battle for Normandy had many chapters, but none as fierce, as intimate, or as defining as Carentan, and for those who were there, it would never end. It would echo in their memories, in their dreams, in every quiet moment after the war, because once you fight in Carentan, you never leave it behind.